Good morning. Nothing says, I tell the joke all the time, nothing says innovation, the future of customer experience like a PowerPoint deck. And I'm a digital analyst by trade, so my job is to study disruptive technology and its impact on business. But I'm here to speak to you this morning as a digital anthropologist. About too many years now, I started to understand that technology was affecting us in our work, but also customers and employees, and how, for example, our relationships with smartphones and Instagram and Snapchat, and how we were slowly changing over time. And that became a bit more fascinating and a bit more necessary to study. So I'm not going to spend this morning telling you about all of the latest tech trends for customer and employee experience. Instead, taking a human-centered approach to have a conversation about what investments need to look like in technology, but also in operations, business, strategy for the future, when our prospects, our customers, our employees, when they're changing and we're not. I call it digital Darwinism. Technology changes, technology evolves, and as a result, so do we. What hasn't kept up along the way are things like processes, policies, metrics, human resources, which I say stands for human resistance. But those things need to change. The analyst part of me is always exploring what are the challenges businesses are facing in everything from digital transformation to corporate innovation. The anthropologist in me is always looking at what do we need to do to be more relevant in these times. But the challenges are always common. They're less technical. They're always human, which is just trying to understand how people are changing, how customers are changing. How do we get our corporate culture to allow us to be innovative? We talk about innovation, but do we actually make decisions about being innovative? Do we have leadership versus management? Do we have a sense of urgency to actually do things differently? Where do we even start? And do we have the expertise or the skill set to move forward in new directions? When we talk about customer experience, or just experience in general, when I study it, it's always a technology-centered conversation. How can we make investments, especially now with AI and machine learning, so that we can scale, so that we can make customer engagement more efficient, more mobile, more real-time? But I think when you take a step back and you look at what it actually means from the customer's perspective, what we're really trying to do is look at all of the engagements that a customer has with us today, how that adds up throughout their journey, and how that amounts to a life cycle that is not just renewed or modern, not just relevant, but fantastic. From their perspective, what does it look like in every moment, and what do those moments look like together? Not just how it is today, but how it could be. If you had to invent your customer journey today versus trying to adapt it for today, it would be a lot different. But the word experience is one of those things that I don't know that we allow ourselves to really let it in terms of what it means. It is something that you feel in a moment, and it can be measured by how you react in that moment. And when we talk about customer experience or employee experiences, what we're really talking about is how does someone feel and react in those moments that we design for engagement. So when we're making technology investments, it's not just about facilitating the transaction, it's can you engage someone in a way that isn't just compelling or productive, but meaningful. And how that person defines meaningful and value is different than how I think we are making decisions. I called today's consumer, lovingly, and today's employee, an accidental narcissist. And that is simply because technology is consuming. And if you think about it, every app you use, every device you use as a human being today tells you you are the most important person in the world. And so when we're designing for customer experiences or employee experiences, what we're really looking at is how do we design for that accidental narcissist in ways that they can experience our business in one moment and the sum of those moments to equate to what our brand should be. when we're making decisions about their experiences, we're doing so removed. We aren't our customers. We aren't our target employees or our employees. We're making decisions based on how we understand business works, but a lot of those models and processes are now coming up on 50 or 60 years old. It's just the way we know how to do things. And so when we're making decisions based on the platforms and the foundations that we have, we're doing so not just from a legacy perspective, but we're starting to become increasingly irrelevant in how we're making those decisions and how they should play out, which is what's causing disruption across all of the markets. So as a humble analyst and an anthropologist, it seems like every day I have to learn something new, trying to make sense of all of these counterintuitive trends that are continuing to unfold. And I realized somewhere along the way, I was getting in my way because I was trying to make sense of how the future was playing out based on the standards of what I know, based on how I've always studied business, based on how businesses have always made decisions, based on quarter-to-quarter performance, based on what shareholders and stakeholders value. But somewhere along the way, in order to make sense of how this was playing out and to make decisions that were going to be more relevant for a customer and employee that was different than me, I had to unlearn many of the things that got me to where I am today. There is a new normal that's starting to unfold. And I am making decisions based on the normal I know. My whole business infrastructure is built on the normal that always was. What happens when we make those decisions based on what we know is that we'll never be innovative. At best, we'll be iterative. Not that that's a bad thing, it's just different. I try to use metaphors a lot because this stuff is also complicated, but this picture to me represents business, operations, processes, strategies, you name it. Most of how we operate, most of what we're trying to do is all designed for that person right there front and center. She is the customer that we've always known. She reflects the processes, the policies, the strategies, the low risk, all of those things that we know very well. And we insist on only seeing her, whereas everybody around her is clearly living life differently. And psychologically, we might look at this picture and say, this is exactly what's wrong with the world today. I can't even go to a concert and see the act because everybody has their phones up, and I'm thinking, why are your phones up? You're here, let's enjoy this moment together. And then I realize I start to sound like that cranky old grandpa. Because when you look at this picture, what's actually happening is just life. Everybody in this moment is actually experiencing whatever it is their way. So who am I to tell them to put their phones down? All I can try to do is understand how to design experiences that are going to be meaningful to them. I'm not them, but does that make it okay for me to make decisions based on what I know versus what they want or how they live? So you could change perspective on an image like this by looking at this person right there in the front and saying, wow, look at this selfish woman, not sharing this super special moment with all of her Facebook friends that couldn't be there. Now they're they're missing out, and she's holding it all in her head. Over time, I've just found consistently what's happening when you study customer experience strategies, when you study digital transformation, when you study innovation, we're just doing so based on our priorities, what we know, and not necessarily from the other side of it, which is often called human-centered or user-centered design, which creates a natural experience divide. The more we make decisions based on what we know without taking into account the other side, that experience divide starts to widen. And that's the exposure for disruption. This is where competitors, this is where startups see these opportunities because they're looking from the outside in. In fact, what I found in a lot of my digital transformation research is that every year, this is the worst stat, every single year, when I ask companies who are focused digital transformation on CX, have you studied your digital customers, the number goes down every single year? No. Yet they're making decisions about their digital customers and their customers without actually knowing why. In fact, this was the biggest drop. It went from 54% to 35% in 1 year. So what happens is, when we're making decisions without actually understanding or being empathetic about how people are changing, we're doing so with a serious cognitive bias, which affects everything. The technologies we use, how we interpret data. I call it, I came up with a fancy name for it, the law of accelerated societal and selfie disruption. But really, all it is trying to appreciate how people are changing, and as a result, what they value, how they make decisions, how they behave, what they prefer. In fact, a lot of this research I'm doing right now with Google is simply looking at how extensively the mobile phone has changed us, and then reverse engineering that to reimagine customer journeys. I think we could go anywhere and watch the wonders of people trying to navigate streets. So as they walk and miraculously look down at their phone and not get hit by every car or bus or train as they do so. I think this was everybody last night, because we think that all of our friends and family are absolutely willing and able to look at the pictures of food that we publish, because what else are they going to do? Right? And when we publish those pictures of that amazing meal we had last night and we don't get those reactions right away, like, hey, where are all the likes? We actually feel bad. Like, what? I thought everybody was waiting for me in this very moment to publish that picture of meatballs. But they're not, because they're too busy sharing their own pictures of their life and how amazing it is. This is actually a real series where a photographer sort of exposes the secret of all those great pictures you see on Instagram, where it's not what it seems, just the good part of life. I call it the new Maslow's hierarchy of needs. What is it, 9:30 and I'm already down 50%. I'm thinking about how am I going to make it through the day. This is real. This is in an article a few weeks ago about this new shower curtain that you could order. It protects all your devices, just in case you need to take a selfie. How many of you see this on your iPhones and you're anxiously awaiting what someone's going to say, and then that text never comes through? And you're left feeling like, what is going on? And you call them. That's by design. It's called persuasive design. All of these techniques that are used in mobile and social media to make it addictive. But these are some of the things. Any parents in the room who have kids who watch kids play with toys on their iPad? It's like the biggest thing right now is that this kid is a millionaire, and he plays with toys for other kids to watch instead of playing with toys. And so I could be that cranky grandpa and say, oh my gosh, in my day, we used to play with toys instead of watching kids play with toys. This is a real crosswalk in the Netherlands. I want you to think about how this conversation went. To me, this is a great metaphor for customer experience. Hey, Bob, we have this problem. People are always looking at their cell phones when they're walking around, and they keep walking into the street, getting hit by bicycles and cars. Well, Brian, let's just chalk that one up to natural selection. Kind of move on with life. Well, Bob, we can't do that because we're in the traffic engineering department and we have to figure out a solution. All right, how about we move the light up here down to the ground so that they can see, oh, I'm going to save my own life and not cross the street right now because it's red. When we think about CX, look at a picture like this. It's radical to have to adjust a street light to save people's lives. You'd think that people would want to do that on their own. But this is the customer journey, because we insist on building upon how we know. Or could we make the light brighter? Could we add audio? Or could we just move the light and reimagine what a journey could be like for a different type of person? And that is where I found consistently, especially with working with so many startups over the years, is that it's all a matter of perspective. How do we choose to see what we're trying to solve? Is it based on the processes that we have and the iterative steps that we've taken to get here, or do we look at things differently? Because we can only take iterations so far. We can only make investments in technology to do things better for so long, versus to do things in new ways. And so I found consistently that innovation that starts with a shift in perspective, that allows us to see and feel and do things differently, is where some of the greatest leaps have been made, even by the most traditional of companies. Because the reality is this: just the average person looks at their phone 1,500 times a week. And that adds up to about 177 minutes a day. Knowing this, I installed the Moments app on my phone to say that there's no way. I'm a power user, and even I don't spend that much time on the phone. And then I got my first report. Congratulations, you've spent 2.5 hours on screen time today. Oh, devastated. What happens in those moments is that we're literally reprogramming our brains. We're becoming more impatient. We're becoming better at finding things. We're becoming great at communicating in short bursts. And all of that plays out in ways that we need to understand when we try to shape the journey and the experience. Most people feel that they're more productive because of their phones, not distracted or not getting hit by cars, but that's another conversation. People actually feel more confident and prepared because of their relationship with their mobile device. And that forms the foundation of this accidental narcissism, is that the more you start to use these apps, these devices, these networks, the more you're conditioning yourself to expect things now. It's why when we post something on Instagram or Facebook and we don't get reactions right away, that we feel bad, because it's designed to give us that constant validation, that constant reward, that constant engagement. But what that's doing over time is just making people more connected, more informed, more empowered, more demanding, more impatient. I'll give you an example. One of the things that I studied, which is funny that I even had to study this, is how long a consumer will wait on a New York street corner for Uber before they open Lyft. You laugh because you've done it too, and I do it. In New York, that number is 5 minutes. Anything that's more than 5 minutes away, you'll open another app, because why would you wait more than 5 minutes for a car to come to you where you're standing? Especially in New York, where you can't even get a taxi if you tried. That's a whole other story. I'll tell you, about 6 years before Uber, I remember getting stuck in New York, and I learned quickly that the 2 times you don't want to grab a cab is at 8 and 5, because those are the shift changes, yet those are the exact 2 times you need a cab. And after flailing arms for so long, and you can finally get a taxi to pull over, and they'll always ask you, where are you going? I'm going to this address. I'm not going that way. Okay, well, thanks. Thanks for the opportunity to have considered me for your ride. And that, I think, is the point, is once you have an experience, regardless of what it is, that becomes so compelling and so engaging that it is the new standard of which we have to compete. We all compete, whether we like them or not, against the Ubers and Lyfts of the world, because they're teaching users and customers and employees to have what they want when they want, right? That's why I had to study how long it's too long to wait for an Uber before you open Lyft. But the same is true for everything. Once you use a service or you work with a company, regardless of whether or not they're a competitor, what they are doing is changing the normal. They're creating a new sense of expectations and preferences and behaviors. And the best innovation that I've ever seen is looking at those customer relationships and taking those insights to inform your customer experience strategy, regardless of what industry you're in, because at the end of the day, it's all human. I tell this story about, well, I work with a lot of financial institutions and insurance institutions that always say, well, we can't change, we can't be innovative, we're regulated, we have lawyers, I understand. But when you look at the market, 4 of the biggest banks in the country are the 4 bottom brands among millennials. Most of them, 3/4 of millennials, believe that they're going to do business in terms of finances with Google, Amazon, Apple in the future, none of which are banks, because they don't want to deal with the bank, because they don't work the way that they want to work. But I'll give you an example. I have an app in Silicon Valley where I live called Filled. F-I-L-L-D, because we don't need extra vowels. And it's basically the Uber of gasoline. So wherever my car is, I just open the app and I order gas. I don't even have to be there, and a truck will magically pull up and fill my tank. And people will say, dude, that is so lazy. Then I have to say, can you help me understand what it is about the gas station experience you love so much that it makes me lazy to pay $1.99 extra to have gas delivered to my car? And for me as a consumer, that starts to become a real value proposition. Why isn't everything like that? And startups and investors are looking at the world, like, why isn't everything like that? And so this is where disruption really starts to come into play, is that we're not comparing how the world is evolving to the customer journey that we provide today. We're just trying to make it better, and we're trying to modernize it in ways that are starting to become counterintuitive, and I call it the cluster funnel. It just looks a lot like this. All great research shows that people don't like going through journeys like this, that if you force me to hear things differently, if you force me to do things differently across channels, I don't like it. Yet, it's difficult to implode all of these things because our very business is actually built on a construct that has different groups by default competing with one another, and thus causing mixed journeys, mixed messages to the customer, because everybody manages different aspects of that journey, and we don't necessarily work together. The most advanced digital transformation and innovation that I've seen are when companies look at how do we fix that problem before we look at how do we invest in innovative technologies. How do we reimagine the customer journey and move people around and give them new jobs, new responsibilities, new metrics, new management to focus on that, because otherwise it always competes against itself. Or when we look at having apps because we have to have an app because the consumer is becoming increasingly mobile, yet not looking at what the best apps do in order to guide an experience that works for them, instead of trying to get them to transact the old way on new devices. This is a real headline from an article. I just cut and paste this because I thought, wow, well, that's great. That's one way to say it. Why your website sucks. It's 2018. Think about this. It's 2018, and we haven't actually had a meaningful conversation about websites since 1995. Most websites are still digital brochures. Think about this. When you've had to have something changed on your corporate site, how crazy that is. I remember talking to one company, well, we have an 18-month waiting list to get changes approved. It's 18 months? Who has 18 months for that? And when mobile devices became a thing, the conversation simply was, well, let's make them mobile. Let's make it work on a small screen. That's a great idea. We never looked at, well, how does shorter attention bursts work what does a website need to become on a mobile device? Instead of just porting the desktop experience to a mobile screen, how do you engage people in 3, 5-second bursts? Every single year this question is asked, customers are saying they want to be able to go through the journey, not just mobile first, but mobile only. They want to go start to finish on the mobile device. And every time I share this stat with executives, they say, well, that number is too low to really think about making that kind of investment for the future. We still have 60% who prefer the desktop web. And I have to sit them down and say, it's not that they love your web. It's not that they love your web experience. They don't love your website. It's just that you haven't given them a choice. So they're forced to go through this clunky journey or this cluster funnel. What if you made the investment to be innovative like all of these other startups that are mobile only? There's a friend of mine who had this cartoon drawn after I wrote a report about mobile first and mobile only design, and this is what he walked away with, and so I wanted to share it with you. I'm just stalling until you figure it out. Because we looked at it as a UX or a design perspective, not necessarily from an experiential perspective. But the more we spend online, the more we start to learn that our impatience just isn't on that screen. It actually starts to spill over in the real world. For some reason, we were okay with standing in line at the Department of Motor Vehicles until we got Instagram. And suddenly, oh, that's ridiculous. Why would I wait in line? This is a really interesting stat from some of my research that I was doing with Google recently, that consumers will bail on most mobile experiences if something takes longer than 5 seconds to load. The average page loads in 15.3 seconds. And this is just a moment I needed to share with you. This is a real dude having lunch in another world. And I had to take a picture of the person behind him looking at me, taking a picture of this guy in a different world. And that moment represented just the quandary of opportunities and complexities that we have in imagining customer experiences when we finally realize we are not the person we're designing for. Now chatbots, everything is chatbots. If you've ever interacted with a chatbot, you realize it's basically the call center 2.0. We're trying to use these new technologies to scale conversations, to use technology to get further away from people, not closer to them. And it's all going iteratively, rather than looking at how can we create more compelling, more engaging experiences for a consumer who's absolutely different. In fact, I always say this, is that you're designing customer experience strategies for people that vomit rainbows. And for some of you who don't know what I'm talking about, there's this app called Snapchat. We talk about, for example, augmented reality and virtual reality as if it's still on the horizon. One day, these are going to be really big things. But what happens is, with every technology, is it slowly starts to permeate itself into our lives where it starts to change our behaviors. Augmented reality is already here. Kids use it every single day, putting dog ears on their face when they're taking selfies. These things are the foundation for true innovation in customer experience. And the way that I define innovation in this regard is innovation is us doing the work to design experiences that matter to a different generation of customers. And I don't just mean millennials, I mean anybody who has a relationship with technology. Instead of asking them to keep conforming to us in order to do business with us. This is a cartoon that I had a friend draw recently. After studying so many corporate innovation centers, and so many of my friends who run those corporate innovation centers quitting because they couldn't actually innovate. And the same response over and over and over again was, I think that they want me to invest in all of these new technologies to improve their old business models, rather than trying to create new business models. So then that got me to really start to think about, well, what does innovation really mean? I think what happens is when most companies talk about innovation, what they're really talking about is iteration. Hey, we invested in AI and machine learning and chatbots, so therefore we are innovative. But when you put those new technology layers on legacy systems, legacy processes, and mindsets, what we're doing is actually using new technology to do the same things better. It's not a bad thing. It's just that is what it is. But innovation is doing new things that create new value. And I think the combination of those two is what leads to disruption, which is doing new things that make the old things obsolete. And when we're looking at our roadmaps and we're looking at our strategies and investments for anything, really, try to bucket it. Is it iteration, or is it innovation, or is it disruptive? Because I think what we end up finding out is that we're not actually innovating as much as we think we are. And I call it the remote control problem. Like websites, it's 2018, and many of us are still stuck with using these remote controls. And if we were to conduct research, how many of you use remote controls? Everybody! Fantastic, then there's no problem with them, because everybody uses them. But then we ask, well, how many of you love your remote control? The only people who will say yes is those who have figured out a solution. So I studied what happened. Over the years, they just got worse. We just started adding more buttons to them. On average today, there are 70 buttons on a remote control. And the way that we think about this is, well, Netflix is super popular now. What do you think we should do about that? Well, let's add a button to the remote control. That sounds great. 71. Rather than looking at the experience that we have as human beings with how we control life, right? Whether that's pinching and zooming, or whether that's voice and things like Alexa or Siri, or whether now it's mind control and thought control, you just think it and it happens. That's the inspiration for innovation, is reimagining the entire customer journey based on not the remote control problem. What if you had to reinvent it today? What could each touch point look like to be not just modern, but exceptional? What does an accidental narcissist expect or prefer in these moments versus what we're trying to give them? We call it the age of assistance. And by we, I mean this is the work that I'm doing with Google, and how it's creating a need for advisor companies. Because in those moments, in those bursts of attention, people actually have intent. And that intent is different than what we've designed for. We've designed for transactions, we've designed for scale, we've designed for efficiencies. But when people in those moments have intent, it's different than what we are offering them today. And what we're trying to do is strip down in those moments. Could you reimagine your customer experience moment by moment, rather than trying to overhaul your entire organization overnight? And this is where we've seen some of the best momentum gather, is because you find places where to start, where to focus, where to have minimal investments in time, resources, and money and technology in order to solve little things and build from it. Because these trends are playing out. They're all mobile inspired. Consumers are over-informed, but they're called well-advised. They're demanding, but we'll call them right now customers. And wherever they are is where they can do business. We call it the right here consumer. 90% of people, when they're looking to make a decision, and I've studied this in every industry, will reach for their phone. And this number goes up every year. Why? Because it's what they have next to them. We can't be bored. We can't possibly sit down and think, because our phone is next to us, so let's grab that. And in those moments, 73% of people will make a decision based on whatever was most useful in those moments. So it kind of strips down the whole funnel approach that we used to know. We consider X amount of companies or X amount of products, we take it into the journey, and we do further research and whittle it down. Now, it's almost like starting from scratch. People want to learn, and it's not just for big decisions, it's for even the smallest of decisions. For example, one of the craziest things that I found is that I look at what are big trends in what people are looking for in those moments on their mobile devices to make decisions. And it's everything that you could possibly imagine. But one of the biggest trends in the last year, there's two that really caught me off guard. One was best toothbrush. How many of you have grabbed your mobile phone to research what toothbrush you're going to buy later? Oh, turns out a whole bunch of people do that. The other one, shower curtains. That's a point of purchase decision for me. Clearly, people need to get the right shower curtain. What that teaches me is that not only can anything be researched, everything is being researched, and what do they find in those moments related to your business along the customer journey? What does that accidental narcissist find? And it turns out, like everybody, decision making is tiring. We have limited mental energy to be able to process all of these things, and we need help because we can't help ourselves reaching for those devices and going through this journey these ways. I believe that when people have intent and they're asking these questions or they're searching for these things, we have to undergo the journey their way as well. What do they find? What are they asking? What comes back? Who's helpful? Who's not? And then start to rebuild the journey, much like the way a Disney or Pixar movie is made. We start thinking about not just facilitating the transaction, but what does the journey look like? How does it unfold? How do people feel in those moments? And how do we add them together? This is what Phillips calls an experience flow, where they've organized the organization, and this is true for their consumer products, but also their medical devices, their business to business, all of their healthcare work, and they look at every step of the journey, whether it's physical or whether it's digital, and then they rebuild it to essentially a story arc of how they want people to feel, how they want people to think, how they want people to make decisions based on understanding the customer, the user, the decision maker. And not that you could read this, but this is something that I've been playing with around experience design, is sort of this fusion, instead of going top down, sort of outside in and bottom up, of looking at customer experience and user experience and service experience, all of these things working in unison in a particular direction to create a new customer experience or employee experience designed as an experience, where it's not just looking at, well, you do this, group, you do this, let's use technology to facilitate it. It's how can we tell that story differently? How can that story come to life differently? What is that story? I found time and time again that if we're waiting for someone to tell us what to do, we're on the wrong side of innovation. Just the sheer nature of how a business operates is by default risk averse. When we look at investing in new technologies and new thinking and new processes, we're just not only risk averse, those are all cost centers because we're taking away from potential shareholder value or stakeholder value because we're taking time and resources and money away from what we can pay out. And so any time that we're thinking about innovation as a cost center, it's always going to be iteration instead of an investment in innovation, instead of an investment in a new possible, a new normal, a new direction. My last research report looked at what I called change agents, the people inside of the organization who really understand this, who nod their heads when we talk about how people are different and how we need to do things differently, but also bang their heads against the wall when no one around them can see or believe that we need to do things radically different. But they're making headway. They're making change possible within the organization because they're focusing on people and how they're different and focusing on those moments where they can solve for them in smaller groups and then take those learnings and those insights and apply them to bigger groups. They're the heroes of the organization. I think that's one of the reasons why, I get up every morning and I do this research to try to understand not just how to solve these problems, but how to really get people to see things differently so that we can solve problems in ways that are more innovative. I think that's where, when we get back to work, where we look at all of our roadmaps and we look at all of our, I always say, like, I tried to be innovative once, but I got stuck in meetings all day. When we look at all of the meetings on our calendar for the week ahead, we have to just start looking at where am I making time for innovation? Where am I making time to band with people like me across the organization to start looking at cross-functional solutions to deliver for this accidental narcissist? Instead of just iterating, instead of just improving upon what is, where can we make even the smallest leaps possible to start having the biggest impact organization-wide? Because you're not alone. I can't tell you how many times I hear, well, we can't do that, Brian. I just can't do it. Versus, we can, because we could find every reason for why we can't. And everybody seems to find all of those reasons, but still the world evolves. Still people change. And someone has to be that champion inside of the organization to not just make investments for the future, but to really start looking around them and questioning, why can't we? Right? If some of you have ever gone through a design thinking program, I'm not the biggest fan of design thinking, but it is something. No amount of design thinking is going to change anything until everybody's perspective changes in what we're trying to understand the problem is and what we're trying to solve for, which is in of itself design thinking. But until we can allow ourselves, our cognitive biases, our understanding, our values, our beliefs of how the world should work, and we look at how the world is changing, we're always going to make decisions based on what we know. It's not a bad thing, but it just pushes us in a direction that we're all familiar with. And I think this is that moment. I think this is that moment where every organization's fate has a new hope, a new promise. Because someone like you believes that the decisions you were going to make yesterday versus the decisions you're going to make tomorrow, and those around you, and the decisions they were going to make yesterday and the decisions they were going to make tomorrow, now start to work in a new direction because you understand the relationship, or you're learning to understand the relationship between iteration and innovation to move an organization in a new direction, because that's the direction that the customer and the employee is already well ahead of us on. So that change has to start somewhere. Technology is an enabler for that change, but that change comes to life because you decided to do something differently leaving here. So on that note, I will say thank you very much for your time and attention, and I wish you the best of luck. Cheers.